Aladdin received his doctorate in clinical psychology in August of this year. His doctoral work focused on understanding and helping treat neurocognitive disorders using tools, concepts of descriptive psychology. He is presently on a postdoctoral fellowship focusing on developing and launching the Sage Mind program at Williams James College. Sage Mind is a primary prevention program for neurocognitive disorders using neuropsychological, medical, and neurological assessments to help track and guide lifestyle choices and outcomes. Aladdin.
Oops, okay. Forgot about that part. It's great to be back. It's wonderful to see so many folks who I really just met for the first time last year. I want to give a couple of acknowledgments and thanks. As Walter just noted, I, thank God, got my doctoral degree finished just a couple of months ago. And there were a couple of people who were instrumental and absolutely essential to my achieving that. William Schwartz, who introduced me to this material and continues to lead our group in descriptive psychology out in Boston. And Ned Kirsch, who was on my faculty committee and really worked more closely with me on this material and has helped me understand it and grow and develop and at least begin to have the inklings of a sense of confidence, though also helping me understand how much more there is to it that I've even yet really begun to get. But in particular, Ned, I thank you so much for the time and the help you've given me. So what I have done back in Boston has focused primarily on primary prevention of neurocognitive disorders. I work right now in a clinic where I am the memory guy, right? So anyone who comes in who has some issue or believes they have an issue around quote-unquote memory is routed to me. I do memory assessments, I diagnose neurocognitive disorders, I diagnose all sorts of other reasons that might be causing someone to have trouble with their memory, and I also diagnose in many cases the fact that there really is no problem with the memory, that it's something else instead. And it got me really thinking, that fact and the fact that I talked a lot about memory in my dissertation, how and where are we treating the notion of memory in descriptive psychology? So I started with going through the glossary, that beautiful index at the back of Behavior of Persons, and I found that the word memory is not listed in that massive volume. It's just not there. And so that sort of prompted me, because the fact of the matter is that this is the case. It really does. I mean, there are entire industries right now based on memory, on assessing memory, on helping people improve their memory. It's a billion-dollar industry. And it's considered clearly within the domain of psychology and the neurosciences as well, and yet, how do we talk about it? Where is it? So what I wanted to do is I'm going to give you an outline of a current debate that's going on outside of descriptive psychology around the notion of memory. I'm going to do this because I think it's really important for us to build bridges, for us to understand the language of neuroscience, to be able to speak the language of neuroscience, and for us to understand how to talk to neuroscientists using our constructs and our concepts and help guide them, I think, in terms of understanding the world akin to the way we do. So I want to talk about how things work outside of descriptive psychology, and then the next step is to do a quick look at where memory and how memory has been treated in the literature, and then the final step is to really do some initial sketches of where we can think of memory fitting in descriptive psychology right now. Where does it fall? What place does it hold? Using the constructs that we have right now. So the debate about memory, and I had no idea that part of this conference was going to weigh so heavily on sort of the biology and biological reductionism and social construction or descriptive psychology, other ways to frame the world as opposed to that.
That was planned.
And it's planned very well, because that's exactly, this clearly is one of the sub-themes. So you're going to hear a little bit about this. And then there's another side out there of people who probably some of you know, but I'm hoping many of you don't know these folks. They call themselves narrativists, and they come out of a lot of the postmodernist thinkers, and they seem to be situated primarily in Europe. And they have penned some interesting articles, and I've got some quotes from them that I'm curious to hear you guys' take on. So what I'm going to start with, and some of you guys, this is probably just review, but this is the current way in neuroscience that memory is conceptualized, right? This is the concept of memory. When you ask someone who's a neuropsychologist or a neuroscientist, what is memory? This is the standard model. That memory is broken up into implicit and explicit. That implicit memory is really memory of things that we do. Driving, dressing, cooking, actions, riding a bike, those sorts of things that most people often don't think of as memory, but that they were learned and became proceduralized over time. That's what we call implicit memory. It's also called procedural memory or non-declarative memory. Those words all mean the same thing. So there's a number of words that are synonymous in this field. The other side is explicit memory, things that we know. So this is things we know as opposed to things we do. Things we know are really broken up primarily into semantic memory and episodic memory. Semantic memory being memory for facts, figures, dates, specific pieces of information. And episodic memory really being memory of events, of narratives. So if someone asks you, what did you do yesterday? You know, oh, well, I woke up, and then I got out of bed, and I brushed my teeth, etc. That's your narrative memory. And then there's this little kind of, to be quite frank, bastard stepchild called working memory. And this is the one that many people in neuroscience are less willing to really talk about because it doesn't fit the model particularly well. And many people would argue that it's not memory at all, but it is still contained within the standard model, and it is considered a form of explicit or also declarative memory. And the notion there is this is memory of very short-term information we want to keep in mind or manipulate for short periods of time, and either then discard or work to transfer or encode into a longer-term memory process. So that's what they say memory is. This is, and I'm routinely called on to give this kind of talk to new students, right? So I work at an assessment center, and the tools that we use to do assessments are largely based around these constructs. And I'm often asked to come explain, for example, the relationship between these constructs and a certain tool that's used to assess memory. The process by which this occurs is said to include encoding, retention, and retrieval. And so this is the memory process. So for those types of memory I mentioned, excluding working memory, because it never quite fits in, but for all those other forms, it's said that you encode them, you either retain them or not, and you later retrieve them. And there's a ubiquitous analogy that's given, a metaphor, where encoding is thought of as a file clerk, right? So memory is portrayed exactly like this. Memory begins when some form of perception or something out there gives me a memory. I'm the file clerk. I'm the encoder. And my job is to take the memory, turn to my file cabinet, find the right drawer, open it up, and slot my memory there. So, and then someone else comes back and says, hey, I need that memory. And my job then is to go back to that file cabinet, to find that folder, find the drawer, open the folder, pull out the file, and hand it back out. And so in this metaphor, the file clerk is seen as encoding. The actual file drawer, an object, a physical thing, is seen as your memory store. And then the file clerk going back and getting that is thought of as retrieval. And so this is routinely used to explain to people who are asking about memory and want to understand memory. This is the metaphor that's given. It's in all the textbooks on neuroscience and neuropsychology. And it's important to understand that because you'll see that the narratives take some, they will dispute these types of models and ways of talking. Very quickly, I just pulled out a couple of people who are extremely well known, and this is the way that they talk. Memory is now considered to be a collection of mental abilities that use different systems and components within the brain to retain information over time. Now that's Andrew Budson. He's Harvard affiliated. He has, quote unquote, written the book on memory. I have 2 of his books on memory. And he's also the mentor and the co-publisher with the person who taught me. So this is the world that I'm taught in, is the Andrew Budson Harvard way of thinking about memory. Another chap says memory is alterations in the connectivity of neurons. This is a man who in 2008 wrote the neuroscience, what was his book called? The Cognitive Neuroscience of Memory. And it was sort of the classic textbooks at the time. It's subsequently been replaced by a book of the exact same name, The Cognitive Neuroscience of Memory, that was published in 2015. I don't know if Ned has seen this one. In that book, the supposition, this cost me $126. And I eagerly opened it to understand, had the conceptualization of memory changed. In that book, they absolutely don't even define what memory is. They just go about using these terms as if they're so agreed upon that it's not worth defining or talking about what memory is. So, and the evidence for this, some of this I think Ray talked about yesterday, in fact, but the case for talking like this includes the fact that if you have hypoplasias or agenesis, that is undeveloped or non-developed aspects of your neuroanatomy, particularly the neuroanatomy that we construe as memory, you will have difficulties and deficits in what we're calling memory. It is also the case that when someone has a neurocognitive disorder, and you look at an MRI of a brain of a person who has this, and you can see certain parts of the brain that might be atrophied or show lesions, you have an extremely high ability to predict what types of memory or changes in cognition you'll see. So that's basically the evidence that's given for talking this way, and I think it's powerful evidence for talking in this way. Now I want to, though, shift to the other folks, and these are the ones I'm curious to know what you guys will make of this. So I'll read these and then do a sort of check of hands or a look of faces to see what you guys make. Memory is a thing, is not a thing, and not a natural kind. Neither memory nor memory disorders can be localized as well-defined and marked off entities, or capabilities, or structures, or systems, or networks of systems, etc. The second quote in particular felt important to me. The brain is social because life is social. Brains are in the service of the person in his or her social life. Brains work according to physiological laws and causal necessities, whereas persons are agents who act intentionally according to social requirements and culturally developed meanings and values. In other words, persons act on reasons, not only causes.
Wow, that's great.
Okay. You guys like that? See, so my understanding, quite frankly, of descriptive psychologist was, I think this really makes sense, but I'm not 100% sure. But then given some of the conversation we had yesterday around Ryan's talk and the notion, and the struggle he had with understanding the differentiating between cause and reasons, I came back to this quote last night when I got home and I thought, wow, this really does fit right in there. So what I think is interesting about these folks is this feels, and I know Wynn has done a real good job of reaching out to other communities and trying to form bridges. I mean, the guys who talk this way, the folks who talk this way, feel like there's someone that our society should be talking to, that we should be forming bridges with. At least, I think, as an initial effort to understand whether we can share information, share ways of going about our business. So the problem is, and these guys cite actually some fascinating information some evidence for their side that I think, as a neuropsychologist, I didn't get a lot of exposure to, and when I did see this, it was glossed over a little bit. But basically, the functional imaging, right? Functional imaging is the imaging like an fMRI or a PET or a SPECT scan. Folks know what these are? Okay, so they're showing usage in the brain as opposed to structure. Of the so-called neuroanatomy of memory cannot distinguish among the following: remembering and perceiving, right? So if I'm just looking at your brain and I ask you to remember Mary Roberts, and then Mary Roberts walks in the door, there's no way for me to see the difference between those two events. By looking at what we routinely call the circuits of memory, Papeza circuits and aspects of the limbic system, the structures that we talk of as memory. Same thing with memory, with perceiving and imagining, and with certain, basically with all types of emotion. That there doesn't seem to be the circuits that we say are causing or responsible for these experiences don't differentiate. And that's kind of a fascinating piece of information that's, I think, fits with that narrative description. Something else is going on, certainly something beyond just that neuroanatomy. A second piece that I thought was interesting that Jens Brockmeyer makes, and I'm using Jens Brockmeyer as he's from Paris, he's at the University of Paris, but he's he cites about 25, 30 other fairly well-known people who are in what he thinks of his camp in this debate about memory. The neuroscientific memory constructs impose a Newtonian model of time and temporalization on memory, but memory is temporalized by meaning and not by chronology. In other words, memory follows a pattern of individual personal significance as opposed to a clear temporal pattern. And he cites various pieces of information, empirical data that we have, like the reminiscence bomb, and the role of salience in memory, and the role of salience and significance in the way we construct our sense of ourselves, which is not based temporally, but very much based on how we've made meaning out of the events that we think of as our memory. So this is the basic debate. What I wanted to do as a first step is just to say, if we take for granted this way of talking about memory, these memory constructs, where would we place them within behavior, within the parameters of intentional action? And I don't think there's a lot of surprises here, though I'm curious to know what people make of this. It feels to me that explicit memory flows primarily from the knowledge parameter, although it's important to note that it isn't the knowledge parameter, that it would be represented by the knowledge parameter, I think would be the way to say it, but that the knowledge parameter represents much more than just what we think of as explicit memory, including semantic and episodic, that there would be an interplay between knowledge and know-how that would account for the implicit memory, for procedural memory, but primarily that would come out of know-how. I mean, we almost have that word as a form of procedure, of process. And I think, and this is purely speculative, but it feels to me that one of the reasons that short-term memory or working memory doesn't fit within the standard model is that in some sense you could say there's a motivational parameter associated with it. In other words, if someone says, here's my phone number, and you're thinking to yourself, okay, I've got to pull out my cell phone and grab that pad of paper, I need to remember that number as long as I can while I'm doing these other things, it feels like there's a motivational component to that. And I don't know if that's, you guys would agree with that, but it feels like there is a piece of motivation involved that's not necessarily involved in that same way. And so that might account to some degree for why working memory doesn't fit very cleanly at all into the standard models, that they don't have a parameter of motivation. They don't have any of these other parameters. But that was one that I'm just wondering might actually have a place there. Yeah. Paul.
Yeah, we'll see if my voice will work today. I can't shed any light on your conjecture about working memory, but I think you can sharpen up a little bit the connection that you put in solid there. Mm-hmm. That if you are trying to conduct an action or describe somebody else's action, that you need, the person needs some knowledge to do this action. And furthermore, it has to come from some place. That would be a reasonable connection with the physical models. That is, if I've got something I want to do, and the explanation for my being able to do it is that, well, you learned this thing a while back.
Yeah.
That's where in the physical model you look for the connection.
Gotcha. Yeah, Gwen?
Just wanted to
Yes,
go-
and I agree with that. That
Real-
we could talk about the embodiment piece as factoring into this, obviously, and possibly a significance piece. Gwen?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the significance piece because of the recursive nature of it. The other thing is, just to, you might remember, back in the early 1950s, what was called the New Look in Perception, and then what became sort of the active cognitive models of Ulrich Neisser and J.J. Gibson, those guys.
Yeah.
They would have kept that W parameter there pretty front and center with at least how perception was going to organize the content of memory. And so, it's focusing on it this way and moving back and forth in such a discussion seems really fruitful.
Well, it's interesting because I like the connection of perception and memory in that early work. Right now, the memory industry almost, I want to say, has carved out its niche, and the perception piece is no longer really talked about. So that might account for why some of the earlier wisdom about this has been lost. T.
Just a thought about why it might get confusing. Whatever is in W, like tautologically is also in K.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So, but there's something different about it, when it's in W
Yeah,
too.
yeah,
And that might be why there's, like they're trying to tease out something.
yeah.
And that you show that.
It's interesting because in the graph one of the graphs I took out, which was in my dissertation, which I know Wynn has seen, is that I actually draw some lines showing the interconnectedness of some of these parameters. So for example, when you have a deficit in K, you necessarily begin to have a deficit in W. That is, you can't want something that you do not know, right? And so that helps understand, or at least gives one frame of reference to a particular way that people who have memory disorders often almost always have some decrease in motivation, or in, there's lots of ways that we talk about. They say initiation, motivation, etc. And always there's some point back to significance, right? And in the initial mark, I threw those in, but for this discussion, I took those out. But yes, absolutely, there's more interconnected.
I just want to say that I'm wondering if we're at risk of thinking of W and KH as operations, and that they're not different operations. And part of just kind of bringing that up.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think you need to be thinking about parameters as just a form of representing different memory functions rather than these memory functions deriving from.
Yes, I know, and you're right, and in the language I have written for me to say, it talks about representation, but I know sometimes I do still go back to that deriving from. Yeah, I'm down with that. So the next thing I wanted to do was look, just because I think you guys already know this, that when you look at the biomedical models, the models that I tend to work in every day, that really what you see is that they're starting with the person characteristic, jumping to embodiment, and really just building downward into levels of detail. And quite literally, many of the textbooks I have are structured this way. They start with the whole brain, the lobes of the brain, the dura mater and the pita mater, sort of the big picture, and then they go into some of the substructures, and then they get down into some of the cellular level, then the intracellular processes, and then you're looking at dendritic connections and so forth. And it really just drives down, and when you do that, you're not talking about behavior, and that's pretty apparent. Although what's interesting is the word behavior is often used in these textbooks, because they'll say something like, the behavior of neural networks, such blah, 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 or the behavior of dendritic connections, blah, blah, blah. And so the word is used a lot. It just doesn't really have any coherent meaning in those contexts, or it's not given one by, it's sort of used in this amorphous way to suggest meaning, or movement, or some form of movement, or interconnection, or relatedness. It's never made clear, but it is used there. But it's not the way I think we would talk about behavior. On the other hand, Jens Brockmeyer and company They, by talking about intentional action and actors and agents, and focusing primarily on the significance parameter, feel to me like they're talking a lot more about behavior, that they're prioritizing at the very least meaning. They don't discount the embodiment component that Budson et al. Are talking about. They just say, you guys are missing the point, basically. You're not wrong, it's just that you're missing what matters. And that sort of harkens back to the way that Ray talks about what's really real, or in this case, the way it's framed is, what really matters here? Well, you can talk all you want about the meanings of these things, but I'm getting the funding to look at the dendritic connections, so that's what really matters, right?
Just a real quick thing. The problem with words like behavior and action, they're used broadly, is that we actually don't know if they're confusing these kinds of meanings. We talk about behavior tectonic plates, for that matter, without implying that they're. And when you talk about discharges of neurons, people talk about action potentials. So the words action and behavior they cover such broad ways of just trying to say that something happened.
Yes.
And
Yes.
without any commitment to intention. The trouble is, within our subject matter, identifying whether you're talking about reflex or intention or something that just happens is a very key distinction.
Yes, agree. And oftentimes it feels like when I read something about behavior in the textbooks I read, they're describing events and processes, right? And I think that's what we would term them as opposed to actual behaviors.
They got it from the engineers and physicists.
Mm-hmm. Probably so, yeah.
Just a quick side comment. In a roundabout way, that kind of language is a demonstration of the primacy of persons. We can't even talk about neuroanatomy without using language that we pull from the world of persons.
Yeah, yes, you're right. We personify neurons. we do. Yeah, right. Yeah, we do. So, a couple of observations, but I think the most important one is the one that I listed last there, which is even folks like Brockmeyer and Company don't appear to have any sort of coherent conceptualization of behavior. While I think they're really on the right track, that they're focusing on things that matter, they don't have a framework for describing the other pieces of what might be going on here. So again, I think these folks might be interesting to talk to. So what I wanted to do is start to think about as, take my neuropsychology hat off and put my descriptive psychology hat on, and hopefully I don't have to do that so much in the future, that I find better ways to bridge these worlds. To start thinking about how we might approach this as descriptive psychology. And a lot of the ideas that I'm going to talk about here, I will liberally use the word borrowed from people like Ned and T. Particularly T has helped me frame a way to talk about this and give me some great ideas, so thank you very much. So we've already talked about this notion of where something fits. A couple of times yesterday people talked about the pawn and what is a pawn, right? And the way we talk about that is how does a pawn fit into the game of chess? And I'm approaching this from that same question of where does whatever we're thinking of as memory, which, right now is in quotes because we haven't really even defined it. Where does that fit in the person concept? Where does it fit? Where does it fall? Some starting points, a micro review of the literature, primarily assisted by T, because I just didn't have access to the material and nor the time to do anything very sophisticated. Some of the things that I've read, and I'll be limited by these, I'll be informed by these, but I'm also limited by these. So when you see this, you'll know that there might be some really interesting articles that I haven't read that are going to inform this conversation. But out of nowhere in Galaxies at 8:30, some of T's work on world construction, and of course Ned's stuff on his blog on the neurobiology is providing for. And just step backwards for a second, a lot of that so-called debate between Brockmeyer and Budson, I think would be resolved if we talked about the neuroanatomy providing for behavior. And what's interesting about that conceptualization is, I don't think that the medical people would have any objection to it. I just don't think it's been offered in any coherent way for them. But most of the people I know who work in the field, like I said, my mentor, Maureen O'Connor, who publishes routinely with Budson, I mean, they're buddies at the VA and at Harvard and BU, I just don't think they would object to that. I think it would be a way to help bring these two sides together and give them a frame of reference for talking to each other. So memory in the DP literature, so here was the startling thing for me, that there just isn't very much. And T really dug to help me find some things. And this is primarily some examples she came up with. So this is from meaning and symbolism. Human abilities are limited and human memory is short, so that an artificial representation of forms of behavior contributes in a perhaps essential way to cooperative effort and communication. That's a reference to memory. I don't know how much it helps us in this debate, although if I understand it correctly, I think Vygotsky is cheering. I think he's an interesting chap who's long forgotten. But and as Ned and I have talked about, we represent, when you work with people who have memory disorders, you represent memory in the environment, right? You try to embed memory context in the environment. So in the sense that this makes sense to me, but it doesn't seem to really quite hit head on the way, sort of what I'm looking for. Here's another one. This is from Maxim C1. If I linger over the memory of that symphony or that tennis match, it is not that I value the memory over the actuality, but rather I value the actuality plus reminiscence over the actuality without reminiscence. Yeah, right? Well, again, it's like that's hard to argue with that, right? But I don't know how much it really helps us here in trying to do what we're doing, which is to understand the place of memory. Maybe it does more than I realize, but it's not jumping out to me right now. If this is from Behavior of Persons, forgiving one's mother-in-law as well as remembering a long-forgotten fact are all things we speak of a person doing, but they are not forms of behavior, and there's no corresponding know-how at all. There isn't a way to do it because the phenomenon is a change in the person, not a behavior that is enacted. This seems to come a lot closer, I think, to giving us a place to talk about memory. But I would point out, in other words, he's talking about this as just something that happens, right? It's an event. So one of the questions I have that I wanted to ask you guys is, can we talk about such a thing as memory behavior, right? Obviously, it would probably, or not obviously, but it would probably be some form of verbal behavior. But what I would point out about this example is, the example he gives of memories, of remembering a long-forgotten fact, right? This is a memory that comes to us suddenly in all likelihood, or maybe you're saying, hey, what was the name of that such and such, and suddenly it occurs to someone. But that's not the only way we use our memories, right? So I think in this context that makes sense, but I think there's more to it. Errol?
Well, you also mentioned earlier the different steps in the process of encoding, retaining, and retrieving, and there may be distinctions in those different processes where one could be considered more behavioral, another, could just be like a store of information, and so forth.
Okay. We'll see if we can fit that in, because that's what I'm going to end this with, is asking you guys to sort of help me think more clearly about this. Here's the next one, and I think this is a little more consistent with that last quote. This is from a rap session, year 2000. And I don't have it, I didn't write the whole thing out, but basically Pete likens memory to other person characteristics. That is, if X is a person characteristics, it is one of the ways that one person can be different from another. So again, in this sense, rather than as an event, you're starting to think of traits, abilities, those sorts of characteristics. And I know some people who think it falls right in there, and that person is smiling right now. But that's another way to look at it. But I think the most, and we're going to get to, I think the question is that the only way to look at it? Is that the best way to look at it? How else might we frame it? And if that's how we talk about it, how do we talk to people who don't think that way, right? That's a far, for saying that it's
Can you just
embedded.
repeat the problem? I'm sorry. I just didn't follow. Memory as a power, ability, or trait.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. That's this quote from the rap session seems to imply that that's how he's thinking about it.
Because we actually did some research within this community, my dissertation was on episodic memory and association and final order appraisals, where the state concept, as part of a personal characteristic, would alter the structure of how memory could be used.
Okay.
Appraised.
So, I thought you said this, your dissertation wasn't relevant to this. But, yeah, okay, so let's hold that then and come back to that, right? So I think so one of the questions I had when I went through those is clearly the paucity, right? Of all of the publications, that's very few references to the concept of memory. And I thought, how do we account for this? Memory was largely forgotten. What do I have to do to get a laugh out of you? Exactly.
I said Pete didn't remember it.
I wasn't going to blame the flop of that joke on you.
It's a flop.
What I'm calling memory is represented in the descriptive concepts of history, knowledge, know-how, want, ability, that we have all of these concepts already, and that among them or across them we represent that thing that other psychologists and neuroscientists are calling memory. Memory is like luminiferous ether or ego. In other words, it's something that we've made up. It doesn't really exist, and if we hadn't called it memory, we would be just fine without it. We'd be probably just fine with abilities and histories and traits and so forth. So that's another possibility. Another possibility is that there's some combination of these would account for it, or that none of these account for it. One of the things I then did was not really being clear on exactly how to proceed, but sort of feeling that some of the person characteristics of knowledge, ability, our notion of history account for much of what we're talking about. I looked through the literature at any document that treated something similar to memory, and I thought Out of Nowhere was the closest document because that's where Pete talks about thoughts, right? And so I thought, well, let me use that as a guide and see where it gets me. When we say, so the first thing Pete did in that paper was when we're talking about thinking, what are we talking about, right? And he breaks it down as in the first page of that. He makes this initial distinction between thinking that and having the thought that. And he essentially says, thinking can be seen as a standing condition. I think that P. I take it that P is the case. This is a standing condition codified by the personal concept of knowledge, which includes beliefs, convictions, opinions, memories maybe, versus I have the thought that Q, that is Q crosses my mind, right? And he then goes on in that paper to address primarily the second case, that Q crosses my mind. That's the one that seems to come out of nowhere. So I thought, well, can we do this with memory, right? And some of you probably can see through this right now, but it was a good exercise for me. I am remembering Q versus a memory of Q just came to mind out of nowhere. Alternatively, I was struck by a memory of Q. Well, so for me, that initial step kind of makes sense. Until you start to compare it a little bit further, which is that when I think that P, when I think that I'm standing in front of a group of descriptive psychologists, that is the case, and it must be the case. But when I thought that P crosses my mind, a random thought, the first one, that the tornado or whatever it was in Mexico was going to come up here and create flooding in Colorado. That thought just occurred to me, right? And that, there's no condition at all that that is the case. Those thoughts that come to us out of nowhere may or may not be the case. They have a different quality to them. But for a memory, it doesn't work that way. If I remember something, it's my memory, and it must be the case, or at least I believe it is. But when a memory comes to mind, it also must be the case. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a memory. I wouldn't recognize it as fitting in my world. It would be something more along the lines of imagining or fantasizing. So that initial step of breaking them down didn't work ultimately for me. And what it meant is that there is probably a different way to break it down. And I didn't have time to do that. So the next thing I did was, I went back to some empirical facts, sort of the emerging way we're beginning to understand memory in neuroscience that a lot of people may not be entirely familiar with. Memory requires construction and reconstruction. So this is a 21st century realization about memory, that every time we recall a memory, we change it. It's not that we're going back and picking something up like a disc or a photo, looking at it and putting it back. People talk about memory this way, but in fact, what we know is every time we do it, we change it. And in fact, the primary researcher in this area, a woman named Lisa Schiller, says that it's more like what people call the telephone game. I learned it as the rumor game, right? Yeah.
It's a really nice analogy for this in terms of photo files on a computer. A raw file is the file that you bring it up, it doesn't change, it goes back, but every time you open up a JPEG file, it changes.
Oh, I didn't even know that. Okay, so there you have it. So that's one piece of empirical information about it.
Because it's a compressed file.
Right, it's a compressed.
Uncompress it.
Uncompress it.
With it.
Oh, I see. So you're introducing error every time. It's almost like a genetic code being redone over and over again. Memory can be easily altered. So this is something that isn't common knowledge, but it can be easily altered. And false memories are exceedingly easy to implant. And there's a woman named Elizabeth Loftus who has a long career of demonstrating empirically that this can be done. And it's a fascinating body of literature. I don't have time to go into it, but let's just say there are limitations to what can be implanted, but it's much broader than most people realize, and it's much easier to do. And then the third piece is that what we remember tends to be consistent to what we already believe is the case, that there's a memory bias. That is, when we encounter a fact that doesn't fit into our worlds well, we're less likely to remember it later, right? So what do all those sorts of things sort of dovetail toward in descriptive psychology? Memory and world construction seems to be a logical way to go with this material. So one thing I loved about Out of Nowhere, he covered this concept. He sort of, it's a far-reaching document. But one of the things that Pete wrote in there is, if I want to engage in a social practice, I have to assign actual individuals to play the parts. You have to cast people, right? You cast people into roles in the world, and as he points out, sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't work so well. But you still do it, because in order to engage in social practices, you have to have all the pieces of that practice in place. And then in terms of behavior potential, he notes, if I start with behaviors that I did not think possible and construct a world which enables those behaviors, then if I succeed, that seems to have a good possibility of changing my world. So these are a couple of reminders about world construction. So what I wanted to do as the final piece of this is think about memory as a form of world construction. I came up with 3 examples of this. Reminiscing about a loved one. So we know empirically that there's something, so I work with older adults. That's where I've done my whole career working with older adults. It's also part of why I became interested in the neurobiology of memory, because it's so important when we work with older adults and for me to talk with other providers. But one thing we know empirically is that there's something called a positivity effect. That when you talk to people, and they're talking specifically, for example, this happens all the time with families. When I talk to grandma or grandpa, their memories of their family tend to be pretty darn glowing. And they're not false, they're not faking it. The research suggests that this is their memory of people and relationships and behaviors. But when you talk sometimes to the children, it's not quite so glowing. And so there's a kind of a selective bias in the memory that creates a more positive recollecting experience, or a more positive experiencing in the reminiscence. So I haven't read a good account of why this is the case exactly. There's a few theories on this, but I don't think it is too much of a stretch to suggest that if I want to see myself as a certain way, as a good grandfather, and I want to have a relationship with my children and maybe access to my grandchildren, if I cast those relationships in more positive terms, that may produce or enable or provide some behavioral opportunity that I wouldn't otherwise have. If I focused on the conflict in the past, this might become a barrier or inhibit or reduce my behavior potential. I don't know if I'm saying that exactly right, T.
Jane's saying the place takes precedence over facts.
Yes.
Those facts take priority.
Right, okay, so place takes precedent over facts. Yes, and so, yes, exactly, that's exactly what I'm going for here.
But I like your description of, if you create that drama that has those places, then you pass for them, and you're more likely to have that.
Exactly.
It's just what you said.
So the way I put it in sort of this format is, if I remember a person as X, I can now treat them as X. And that seems to be sort of the logical construction of that type of reminiscing. So reminiscing, again, isn't remembering. There's something active about it. It's a form of construction.
And if you treat your life as meaningful and having significance, at the end of one's life, is a good time to be thinking that way.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
So you reconstruct your history to give it that kind of place in your life.
Yes, that's absolutely. It's a related example,
Yeah.
another perfect example. Yeah. T?
The other thing for the clinicians, I know Sonia's probably done the thing of being a member of the country club. Does that ring a bell? And no, maybe not. But if you are a member of the country club, and maybe you're not a very good member, you can't play golf, you can't socialize, your conversation is horrible, you get sick if you have a drink, but you really are a member. And so then you can get better at all those things. And so in this case, if people in their memories give themselves that good place, they can actually get better at doing it, and it'll be authentic. They won't be faking it. Yeah.
Okay.
Talk some about the being, but first you have to be a poker player.
Yes. Yeah, that's the being a poker player is the same.
It's a well-known fact in golf that if you focus on the shot going well, you have a much better chance of hitting it well. The way you get to your opponent is to say, watch out for the water on the right. It's the same, right?
Sure.
Be in competition.
Don't play golf with this one. Yeah, that's funny because in terms of procedural memory, we were taught the same thing as tennis players. That when someone is like really playing well and you are losing, when you're up at the net between, you say, "Wow, you're really nailing that forehand. How are you doing that? How is your feet?" You get to start thinking about it. So you break the procedural piece there.
I think we might be doing this throughout our whole lives. Ideas of, you hear people say just in comment that things happen for a reason, or this is my path. And it's them trying to reframe events that might or might not have positive or negative effects on some sort of salvation goal. And I mean, if we look at the way we treat our careers, the meaning of our career is, we're always looking for that end goal where I've accomplished something. And so the whole time we're almost building this positive construct, and then by the end, we're so used to doing it, we're probably just going back and reorganizing everything into the thing we've been doing the whole time.
Yeah, we're reorganizing the past in order to fit who we are today.
That constantly, the entire time.
And Schiller actually talks that way. Dr. Schiller talks that way. She talks about that memory represents who we are today, not a picture of our past.
I think there's also you have to give value in order to get value out of a relationship, for instance, or anything.
Well, that actually is a great segue into another example I had, which was, it used to be called for Aaron, it was called Reminiscing with Trav, who's a good friend of mine, Tina's Trav, who I'm seeing later tonight. But this is an actual event that happened last year when I was here. And I shared this with the Boston group. So a friend of mine and I, we traveled together all around the world for months and months on end, more than 20 years ago. And when we get together, which sometimes can be once every 3 or 4 years, the first thing we always do is talk about those experiences. That is, we reconnect based on those experiences. And so last year when we were doing this, because what it does is it gives us a place in each other's lives, in the present, from which we can then begin to have our interaction. It sort of cements that relationship in a certain way. So what happened last year was Travis had told this story, this memory story, and we had great chuckles about it, and it was dangerous, and we complimented ourselves on being alive, etc., etc. And then I started to tell this story about the two of us in South Korea taking a bus south to a little village where they were serving, and T, you might want to close your ears for this, where they were serving 12 different types of dog stew. Because the Olympics were forthcoming in Seoul, and they were closing all these shops down. So they were trying to clean up the whole eating dog thing in South Korea at the time. So I'm telling this story, and I'm laughing, and suddenly I look at my friend Travis, and he's got this strange look on his face, and he says, "I've never been to Korea." At which point what I realize is I was with someone else. But as a process of reestablishing this relationship and co-constructing this relationship, I've literally taken him and put him into the seat on this bus that I was on, and had remembered him. My memory, and someone could have tested me, the accuracy of my memory was as accurate for him being there as it was for anything else that happened in that case. But in fact, it was entirely a non-random memory error that I had constructed.
But you cast him.
Yes, I cast him as that friend, exactly. And so the way I put it is, if I remember that X connects us, I can treat this as connected by X. So this is another sort of way that we can think of memory as a form of construction. And then the last one, and that actually brought me to a couple of interesting notions. One of them was, can we think of remembered relationships as a transformation of actual or in-person or real-time relationships? And what would be that transformation? How would we get there? And what would it mean? But I think the most interesting one, reading about T's stuff on dreams and the flexibility we have in behavior potential in dreams, and then thinking, well, memory actually gives us a kind of flexibility, not at all equivalent to dreams, certainly, but much more sort of behavioral flexibility than I think we have in our everyday real-world interactions. And I think that's part of what happened with Trav, is that the flexibility of my memory was confronted by an actual real-world experience in that case. Yeah, well.
Some of the literature on false confessions
Yeah.
could be helpful here in helping to articulate some of the world constructions, the status moves, the processes that go into shaping, into positioning a person, and binding a person into a position, where they treat some things as having been facts. Because the person in a false confession, it's not just that they're lying,
Right.
that they're actually,
They've come to believe it.
they many times will just simply adopt that.
Yeah.
But how that's executed, I mean, because plenty of people are manipulated into these false confessions.
Yes.
So that might be an interesting thing to look at in terms of how it's generated.
That's a great idea.
And where status fits into this.
Certainly. Yes.
Another thing I wanted to say is that actor and observer are key, I think, very important concepts here.
Yes.
An actor's memory is very different from an observer's described memory.
Yes.
Just one sort of thing that I wanted to say about when you bring up significance and salience. Sometimes I will see people who have almost no education be tested. And I'm thinking of the person who has a place for being tested, versus the person who has no place in their life history for being tested.
Yes.
And basically, we're talking about social practices here, in which that has a place in someone's world, and one where it doesn't have a place in someone's world.
Yes.
And the effect that that's going to have on performance in testing.
Yes.
And neuropsychologists are likely to put this only into the context of effort, which basically says lazy sloth. Well, anyway.
Or worse,
Or
or
worse,
like
right.
you say,
Yeah.
you've got these problems, these deficits, and I'm diagnosing
Right.
you with.
But I'm saying, this is another aspect that I've seen that where I just will read reports on neurocognitive evaluation and I'm just annoyed because there are just some things there in the scenery that are not being taken into account.
I 100% agree with you. It makes it very hard. I am not doing it that way. I just want you guys to rest assured that. But I'm doing it right now. And this is a different discussion that I almost went this way, like how I'm doing neurocognitive assessment differently based on significance and meaning and principles very much that are shared here. That was the alternative talk to this one. But yes, you are absolutely right. And I think anyone, for lots of reasons, that happens in lots of cases, that happens with people who are having some sense of confusion. And they're diagnosed, I think, incorrectly because of the types of performances and what they mean. Yeah.
This sort of stuff, memory problems come up in marital therapy all the time. People remember differently all the time, and they will describe, even very short-term things that happened yesterday. In terms especially of disagreements and arguments and what people said. And this also goes toward actor-observer because, I will say, what do you mean? And you say, he said, what do you mean? No, I didn't. I said, well, what do you mean? They have these big arguments. The other thing, though, that happens right in front of me sometimes is that people will remember differently almost instantly because they are reinterpreting what the person just said. So I might say, I don't like the way you deal with our kid. And the other one says, you think I'm a horrible parent. No, I didn't say that. You just said that. You just said that. And then they'll say to me, didn't they just say that? And they'll always accuse each other of lying. I will not sit here and go through this if you're just going to lie to her.
Yeah.
And I tell people all the time, they're not lying probably. People remember things, you have to understand that. Everyone remembers things differently all the time.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming you're both telling me the truth from how you see it. And I would like you to assume that too, and we'll try to sort it out.
Benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, and that's a sort of world construction too.
Yeah.
A lot of what we're talking about now is ways that memory can change or get distorted based on the place of a memory in a person's mind.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
But I think there's also value in looking at things the other way. In what ways do social practices, relationships facilitate the recall of information that might otherwise be lost? I also think it's important, as you're talking about it, what I've been thinking is maybe the problem is the word memory.
Yeah.
It would be nice if we had language that we could use that is different for, say, memory when I'm trying to memorize a poem.
Yes.
Or studying for a test, right?
Yeah.
Versus memory that is critical for me to be a competent member of a community.
Yes.
These are different kinds of memory, and I don't think there's language maybe outside of descriptive psychology.
So that's great, and I want to wrap this up because I know we're starting to run over. There is an emerging field of what they're calling social memory. And it's really still in the not even half-baked stage yet.
Yeah, I don't want to lose track of the concept of memory as a power or an ability. Where the sort of thing where somebody said, how can you tell me 2 weeks later what the definition is of this whatever that you read once in a book? And the answer is, I don't know. And then years later, you can't do that anymore.
Right.
That's
right.
different.
Yes, agreed. There's a change in ability there. Yeah. When?
I think I can throw just a little bit of light on why descriptive psychology has so little place in its literature for memory. Something I just recalled that Ned's comment. There actually was a seminar that Pete and Lyle Bourne conducted in, I believe, if I remember correctly, the spring of 1976. Bill Plotkin and I were in it with members of the experimental psychology program. And what the target was consciousness and memory. And it was the only seminar I ever was in with Pete, very small group, where there wasn't a sense of coherence that emerged. And a lot of the problem is that it was the slipperiness with which we wanted to use terms like memory. We couldn't find grounding.
Yeah.
And the notes from, since I talked, are seemingly lost from that seminar.
Okay. Yeah, but I think you're right. I mean, I have to close it up here. I want to just leave with this last slide, which are some unexplored topics. Obviously, the one that was brought up, I had a couple slides on this. I took them out. I knew I was going to get to them. But there's clearly something interesting about ASC and memory and an actor's memory versus an observer and critic memory. Exploring links from remembering to action. So there's some interesting neuroanatomical stuff right now, sort of emerging functional imaging that shows that if I tell you that I'm going to ask you to remember something, that they're in the same way that if I tell you that I'm going to ask you to raise your hand, you can see in the brain the preparation for that action. The same thing happens when I tell you that I'm going to ask you to remember something. That there's an actual shift in sort of basically the activation of certain parts of your brain to prepare for a memory, not behavior, but a memory something. And then obviously, I think what Wynn was getting at, and this notion of slipperiness, and having a language for differentiating, having a memory from remembering, to forgetting, to some of the things that Ned brought up, memory in different contexts, social memory, emotional memory maybe, I have no idea, but to try to clarify the language of memory in order to help understand its place. And that's, I gotta stop.